This 14-year-old girl is accused of stabbing her sister to death in their Lancaster County home.
Well, police say that when they arrived here at 1:15 a.m. this morning, there was actually blood on the snow on the ground, especially right here in the driveway. They say 14-year-old Claire Miller was standing outside, apparently trying to wash her hands of the blood in the snow. The criminal complaint says Miller called 911 and reported that she stabbed her sister, 19-year-old Helen Miller. Helen was found in bed with a large knife in her neck. Officials say the girl's parents were asleep during the incident.
This is shocking and tragic. It's not the kind of thing we would expect in our neighborhood. It's very quiet and peaceful, and obviously a tragedy like this is sad news.
Miller was charged as an adult with 1 count of criminal homicide. She was arraigned this morning, denied bail, and transported to Lancaster County Prison. We've just learned that Claire is in 9th grade at nearby Lancaster Country Day School. The school says that they are offering counseling services to students impacted by this event. And Claire's next hearing will be a preliminary hearing that's scheduled for this Friday.
It's 1:08 a.m. in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. A quiet street, porch lights glowing through the winter fog. Police radios crackle with a call that stops them cold. A teenage girl on the line, her voice trembling. "I think I killed my sister." Minutes later, officers pull up to the small 2-story home on Clayton Road. A 14-year-old stands outside barefoot in the snow, blood on her sleeves, eyes blank and distant. Inside, the house looks untouched, a lamp still on, a blanket draped over the couch, the television frozen mid-scene. But upstairs, the illusion of safety ends. 19-year-old Helen Miller lies motionless under her blanket, her wheelchair beside the bed. The silence feels heavier than any sound. Moments earlier, this was a home. Now it's the scene of a tragedy that would shake Lancaster to its core. She was only 14, but that night she stopped being a child. When the first Manheim Township patrol cars turned onto Clayton Road in the early hours of February 22, 2021, snow still covered the lawns, and the neighborhood was silent. Officers expected a routine welfare check, maybe a misunderstanding, but the dispatcher's note was brief and chilling. Juvenile female reporting she killed her sister. At 1:13 a.m., headlights swept across the Miller driveway. A teenage girl stood outside barefoot, her pajama pants soaked from the snow, her hands streaked with blood. Body cam footage later confirmed her tone was calm, almost detached. "I stabbed my sister," she said as the officer approached. "She's upstairs." Inside, the house looked ordinary, as if time had paused. The television was still glowing in the living room, a blanket draped neatly over the couch. Officers moved quietly up the staircase, weapons drawn, but hearts pounding. In the back bedroom, they found 19-year-old Helen Miller lying in bed beneath a comforter, a visible wound to her neck. Beside her, the pillow was soaked through, the bedsheet pulled tight around her shoulders. One officer radioed in. "Victim located. We need EMS now." But by the time paramedics arrived, it was already too late. The official record lists the time of death as 4:13 a.m., a formality for a life already gone. Downstairs, Claire was placed in handcuffs and seated on the bottom step of the staircase. On the body cam audio, one of the responding officers can be heard saying softly, "Claire, what happened tonight?" Her answer came without hesitation. "I don't know. I just did it." Another asked, "Where's the knife?" and she nodded toward the kitchen. Investigators later recovered a blood-stained kitchen knife from the sink, matching the wound found on her sister. As they let her out into the cold, she muttered, "I didn't mean to hurt her. She was sleeping." Detectives who processed the scene described it as eerily still. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, nothing stolen. The only disturbance in the entire house was upstairs, one bedroom torn apart by an act that made no sense. The district attorney's initial report would later confirm. The victim was found lying on her back with a stab wound to the neck. There was no indication of a fight or defensive injury. Every clue pointed to one devastating truth. This had happened within a family that, until that moment, had seemed ordinary. At 2:45 a.m., Detective Keith Neff arrived to begin the first phase of documentation. His notes recorded that the temperature outside was 29 degrees and that the suspect was cooperative, coherent, and quiet. He wrote, "Juvenile appears aware of the situation but emotionally flat. Expresses remorse intermittently." Claire was transported to the Lancaster County Prison's juvenile holding area for preliminary questioning. When asked if she understood why she was being detained, she replied, "Because I hurt Helen." Meanwhile, officers made the most difficult call of the night, to the Millers' parents. They were staying overnight at a hotel in the city, unaware of what had unfolded at home. When detectives explained what had happened, the line went silent before a single broken word emerged. No. Later, in a statement released by the family through their attorney, they said, "Helen was the light of our home. Our hearts are shattered." By morning, the neighborhood was lined with police tape and satellite trucks. Reporters huddled against the February wind as officials briefed the press. District Attorney Heather Adams addressed the cameras around 9 a.m. "This is an incredibly tragic and unusual case. We have charged a 14-year-old with criminal homicide following the death of her sister, 19-year-old Helen Miller. Because of Pennsylvania law, the charge must proceed in adult court." Her voice wavered slightly as she added, "We ask the community to withhold judgment until the full facts are known." For the investigators, the scene remained confusing long after the evidence was bagged and labeled. They photographed every surface, searched for signs of prior violence, found none. They checked phone logs, tablets, and social media accounts. Nothing hinted at conflict or warning. One detective later told Lancaster Online, "It was one of the strangest things I've ever walked into. No motive, no argument, just gone." As dawn spread pale light across the snow, officers watched the coroner's van pull away from the driveway. It was quiet again, but this time the quiet felt permanent. Back at the station, the overnight report was compiled. Suspect, Claire Miller, age 14. Victim, Helen Miller, age 19. Weapon, kitchen knife recovered from sink. Under remarks, an officer added, "Suspect remained calm, cooperative, made several spontaneous statements including, 'I stabbed my sister, and I didn't mean to.'" Those words, flat, factual, emotionless, would follow her into every courtroom document that came after. Later that afternoon, as investigators finished collecting the last pieces of evidence, one of them paused in the upstairs hallway, staring into the now empty bedroom. "She didn't run," he said quietly to a colleague. "She waited." The other nodded, eyes still on the blood-stained pillowcase. "Yeah," he replied. "But for what?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered, echoing down the staircase and out the front door. And that's where the story turns. From what was found to why it happened. Because for detectives, understanding how a 14-year-old could walk into her sister's room that night would become the hardest part of all. At 4:30 a.m. on February 22, 2021, Claire Miller sat in a small gray interview room at the Manheim Township Police Department. The fluorescent light above her buzzed softly, reflecting off the metal tabletop. Her wrists were free now, wrapped in a blanket that nearly swallowed her hands. Detective Keith Neff started the recording and said gently, "Claire, we just need to understand what happened tonight." She nodded but didn't look up. When asked if she knew where she was, she whispered, "At the police station." Her voice was calm but distant, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Detective Neff asked, "Can you tell me about Helen?" Claire paused for several seconds before answering. She was sleeping. Then, quieter, "I wanted her to stop making noises." Those were the first words investigators would later quote in the affidavit of probable cause. She never raised her voice, never cried. When officers pressed for why she thought Helen was making noises, Claire gave no clear answer. "It felt loud," she said finally. "I thought it would never end." The detective wrote in his report that her responses were fragmented and confused. As daylight broke over Lancaster, a team of investigators began reconstructing the hours leading up to the attack. They mapped a timeline using witness statements, phone data, and home Wi-Fi logs. Around 9 p.m. the previous night, Claire's parents had said goodnight to both daughters before going to sleep. There had been no argument, no sound of distress. The next evidence point came from the 911 call itself, time-stamped 1:08 a.m., in which Claire clearly identified herself and reported, "I think my sister is dead." The emergency dispatcher described her tone as flat, emotionless. By mid-morning, the district attorney's office held a press conference confirming the charge of criminal homicide. "This is a tragic, heartbreaking case," DA Heather Adams said. "Because of Pennsylvania law, this case begins in adult court, even though the defendant is only 14. That legal requirement, rooted in decades-old statutes, would later spark statewide debate. Reporters asked if investigators had found a motive. Adams replied, "We have not identified one at this time." Behind her, detectives stood silent. At Claire's school, word spread quickly. Students from Lancaster Country Day described her as bright but quiet. One classmate told WGL News 8, "She was shy but kind. I never saw her angry." Another said, "She talked about her sister a lot. She said Helen was funny and liked music." Teachers told police she'd recently been withdrawn and missing assignments, something they attributed to the stress of remote learning and her mother's health issues. Counselors confirmed she had been referred for therapy the previous year after showing signs of depression. All of this painted a portrait of a girl struggling privately long before that winter night. Over the following weeks, forensic and psychiatric experts evaluated Claire at the Lancaster County Youth Intervention Center. Records later presented in court show she was diagnosed with major depressive disorder with psychotic features. Dr. Karen Rice, the court-appointed psychiatrist, testified that Claire was experiencing auditory hallucinations and delusional beliefs in the months preceding the incident. According to Rice, Claire described hearing whispers telling her that something was wrong in the house and that she had to fix it. Rice told the court, "Her perception of reality was severely distorted. She did not express anger toward her sister, she expressed confusion." Investigators also documented the physical evidence. Fingerprints on the kitchen knife matched only Claire's. There was no defensive wound on Helen, confirming she had been asleep. The blood on Claire's clothing matched both sisters. The crime scene report stated plainly, the event appears spontaneous with no premeditated indicators. Detectives scoured digital devices for online searches or messages suggesting planning, and found none. Her phone history contained nothing beyond ordinary teenage content, music playlists, school emails, and photos of her sister smiling beside her. In March 2021, prosecutors and defense attorneys met for the first pretrial conference. Assistant District Attorney Mark Fetterman summarized the state's position. "The evidence is clear as to who committed the act. The question before us is why." That why became the center of the case. The defense argued that Claire's psychosis blurred the line between intent and illness. The prosecution argued that calling 911 showed awareness. When asked during a subsequent interview why she made the call, Claire reportedly answered, "Because it was wrong." Over the next 2 years, mental health professionals examined her repeatedly. Each report echoed the same theme: severe mental illness, but cognitive understanding of wrongdoing. One evaluation noted that she was remorseful, tearful, and disoriented about time. Another stated, she recognizes she caused the death but continues to believe something compelled her. These findings became the backbone of the eventual plea deal. Outside the courthouse, the community wrestled with disbelief. Local pastor Richard Eichelberger told ABC 27, "People ask me, how could a child do this? But what I tell them is, sometimes tragedy hides inside ordinary homes." Parents attended school forums on adolescent mental health. Donations poured in for disability support groups in Helen's memory. Even those who demanded punishment admitted they struggled to see malice in a girl who still looked like a middle school student. By the time detectives closed the investigative file in late 2022, more than 600 pages of reports filled the binder: scene photos, lab results, psychiatric notes, and transcripts. The conclusion section read, "No evidence of external involvement. Offender acted alone." underlying mental illness significant factor. The findings confirmed what the community already feared. There was no reason, no pattern, no warning sign that could have predicted what happened. Detective Neff later reflected in an interview with Lancaster Online, "You always look for motive, but in this one, motive didn't exist in the usual sense. It wasn't hate. It was illness." His comment would echo through the courtroom months later when prosecutors tried to balance compassion with accountability. And as the case moved toward trial, one haunting observation from that initial night stayed in every investigator's notes. Claire's handwriting on the statement form was uneven, the letters large and shaky, as though written by someone trying to remember how to spell her own name. Beneath her signature, she had written two words that none of them expected: "I'm sorry." By late March 2021, the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office announced that 14-year-old Claire Miller would be formally charged with criminal homicide. District Attorney Heather Adams told reporters, "Because of Pennsylvania law, all homicide cases, regardless of age, begin in adult court." It was a statement rooted in statute, but heavy with moral weight. The sight of a middle school girl being led into a courtroom in handcuffs left the county in stunned silence. Cameras clicked as she was escorted through the courthouse hallway, her small frame swallowed by an orange prison jumpsuit, her wrists bound in front of her. Reporters shouted questions she couldn't answer. A court officer who stood nearby later told Lancaster Online, "She looked lost, like she didn't understand the world around her anymore." The hearing was brief but unforgettable. Inside the courtroom, Claire sat beside her defense attorney, Christopher Tallarico, staring at the table in front of her. She was too short for the chair. Her feet barely touched the floor. Across from her, prosecutors laid out the state's case. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of another suspect. No explanation other than her own words. "I stabbed my sister." The judge read the charges slowly, pausing after each one. When he asked if she understood, she nodded once. Her voice, recorded on the transcript, was barely audible. "Yes." Outside the courthouse, the community struggled to make sense of it. Neighbors who had known the Millers for years described the family as loving and quiet. One resident told WJAL News 8, "You'd never expect this here. She was just a kid who sold cookies for a fundraiser last spring." Another added, "I see her in my mind as that girl on a bike, not someone in handcuffs." Social media filled with shock, disbelief, and anger. Some demanded the maximum penalty. Others pleaded for compassion. The headlines read, "Lancaster teen charged as adult in sister's murder." Back inside, the legal teams began preparing for what was certain to be a long process. The prosecution argued that despite her age, Claire's actions showed intent. "She knew what she was doing," said Assistant District Attorney Mark Fetterman. "She hid the weapon. She called 911. Those are choices made by someone aware of right and wrong." The defense countered that her psychosis was profound and untreated. She was hearing voices. She was in a delusional state, Attorney Tallarico explained in an interview with Fox 43. "Our goal is not to excuse the act, but to understand it." The judge ordered a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation and ruled that, for now, the case would remain in adult court. Through 2021 and 2022, experts examined Claire repeatedly. Dr. Karen Rice, the same psychiatrist who had diagnosed her with major depressive disorder with psychotic features, testified during a preliminary hearing. Claire's mental illness is severe and long-standing. She experienced hallucinations instructing her to act. However, she was able to distinguish right from wrong at certain moments. Those final words, "at certain moments," became the hinge on which the case would turn. Prosecutors seized on them, arguing that even a flicker of awareness meant accountability. During one court session in 2022, Dr. Rice expanded on her findings. "She told me that she heard whispers," Rice said. "She said they told her something bad was going to happen to her sister. She described feeling she had to stop it." When the prosecutor asked whether Claire had described the act itself, Rice answered, "She said she thought she had to help, and then she called for help after. It was the clearest evidence yet that delusion, not malice, drove her actions. But the law required proof of intent, not emotion. As proceedings continued, each side built a portrait of Claire that reflected their argument. The prosecution's portrait showed a calculating teenager who waited until her parents were gone before acting. The defense's portrait showed a frightened child trapped inside a mind she no longer trusted. When the court played portions of the 911 call, the room fell silent. "I think I killed my sister," Claire's voice said. "She's dead. She's in her bed." The dispatcher asked, "What happened, sweetheart?" Claire's reply, steady and low, "I stabbed her." The recording lasted only 30 seconds, but it froze the room. Reporters later wrote that even the prosecutor looked down when it ended. During one pretrial hearing, Assistant DA Fetterman pressed the psychologist further. "Doctor, was she capable of understanding her actions?" Rice answered, "She was aware enough to hide the weapon and call 911. That statement made headlines across Pennsylvania. To the prosecution, it meant proof of legal responsibility. To the defense, it underscored the tragedy of a child conscious enough to feel guilt, yet powerless to stop herself. By late 2022, after months of hearings, the outlines of a plea agreement began to form. Claire's attorney requested that the charge be reduced from first-degree to third-degree murder, paired with a plea of guilty but mentally ill. Prosecutors agreed, recognizing both the depth of her illness and the evidence of her awareness. The arrangement would spare her a life without parole sentence but guarantee decades behind bars. When the plea was announced publicly, the reaction was divided. Some called it merciful, others saw it as too lenient. Outside the courthouse, one man held a sign that read, "Justice for Helen." Across the street, another sign read, "Treatment, not prison." A local pastor interviewed by ABC 27 said, "People want clear answers, evil or innocent, guilt or forgiveness, but sometimes there isn't one." At the final pre-trial hearing in early 2023, Claire appeared before the court again. She wore a simple gray jumpsuit and spoke only once, when the judge asked how she would plead. "Guilty but mentally ill," she said softly. Her attorney placed a hand on her shoulder as the judge confirmed the plea and scheduled sentencing for the following month. Reporters in the hallway described the moment as muted, heavy, and sad. As the crowd dispersed that afternoon, Detective Neff stood at the back of the courtroom, staring at the empty witness stand. He later told Lancaster Online, "That case still keeps me up at night. I've seen murder before, but never like this. This wasn't hate, it was confusion." His partner added, "In that courtroom, childhood and accountability collided, and neither survived intact." By the morning of March 10, 2023, the Lancaster County Courthouse was filled to capacity. Journalists, students, victims' advocates, and community members all pressed into the small courtroom where the most closely watched trial in county history was about to end. Claire Miller, now 16, was led in wearing a plain gray prison uniform. Her wrists were shackled loosely at the front, her dark hair tied back, her face pale. After 2 years of waiting, hearings and evaluations, this would be the day the court delivered its sentence. At the front of the courtroom sat Judge David Ashworth, a man known for his measured tone and meticulous attention to the law. To his left, Assistant District Attorney Mark Fetterman reviewed the prosecution's final documents. Across from him sat defense attorney Christopher Tallarico, who had represented Claire since the night of her arrest. Reporters' cameras clicked briefly as the session began, then fell silent when the judge ordered no further photos inside the chamber. The district attorney's office summarized the state's case one last time. "This is not an act of self-defense," Fetterman said. "It is not an accident. It is an intentional killing of a 19-year-old woman by her younger sister." His voice was steady but firm. "We recognize the defendant's youth and her diagnosis, but the fact remains, she understood what she was doing. She knew it was wrong. She admitted it in her own words." He lifted the transcript of Claire's recorded statement, reading aloud, "I stabbed my sister. I didn't mean to hurt her. but I did." He then set the papers down, saying, "Those are her words. They speak for themselves." When it was the defense's turn, Tallarico rose slowly. His tone was calm, almost weary. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is not about denial of guilt. It is about understanding the mind of a child who was deeply ill. Claire Miller was 14 years old. She was hearing voices, experiencing delusions, and had lost the ability to distinguish reality from fear. She called 911 not to flee justice, but because she knew she needed help. That act alone should tell us that her humanity is not lost." He motioned toward the defense table where Claire sat motionless. "She accepts responsibility. But we ask this court to recognize that punishment alone cannot heal what illness destroyed." The courtroom remained still as the judge nodded, flipping through the psychiatric evaluations that had been filed in the months leading up to the hearing. Each report said the same thing in slightly different language: severe mental illness, awareness of wrongdoing, limited comprehension of consequences. Dr. Karen Rice, the court-appointed psychiatrist, was called once more to clarify her findings. "Claire's mental illness is genuine," she said. "At the time of the offense, she was suffering from psychotic symptoms. However, she was aware enough to conceal the weapon and to contact emergency services immediately afterward. Those actions suggest partial understanding of her behavior." When Dr. Rice finished, the courtroom fell silent again. Helen Miller's family members sat in the first row, heads bowed, hands clasped. A victim's advocate stood beside them and read a brief statement. "Helen was the light in our home. We will spend the rest of our lives missing her laughter. We forgive, but we will never forget." The mother's quiet sobs were audible through the courtroom microphones. The moment that followed would define the entire case. Judge Ashworth adjusted his glasses and looked toward Claire. "Claire Miller," he said slowly, "you have pleaded guilty but mentally ill to third-degree murder in the death of your sister, Helen Miller. This court has reviewed every report, every testimony, and every letter submitted on your behalf." He paused, the courtroom completely still. "This is, without question, one of the most tragic cases ever to come before me." He went on to explain the balance the law required, the need to acknowledge her illness, but also the need for accountability. "You were 14 years old, but you took a human life. The law does not excuse that. It asks that you serve the punishment required by statute." He looked down, then continued, "Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to not less than 12.5 years, and not more than 40 years in the State Correctional Institution for Women." Then, in a line that reporters would later use as their headline, he added quietly, "If you serve the maximum term, you will die in prison." The words struck the room like a hammer. For a moment, no one moved. Even the air seemed to stand still. Claire didn't react. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Her attorney closed his eyes and rested a hand on her arm. Across the room, Helen's family members wept openly. The judge lowered his head briefly before standing and leaving the bench. The bailiff's voice broke the silence. "Court is adjourned." Outside, the courthouse steps filled with reporters and onlookers. Cameras flashed as both legal teams made brief statements. Assistant DA Fetterman said, "This was a just outcome under Pennsylvania law. The sentence reflects both accountability and compassion." Defense attorney Tallarico gave his own short comment. "Claire Miller is a child who needed treatment long before tragedy struck. We can only hope that treatment now brings understanding." By evening, the story had gone national. CNN, The Washington Post, and NBC News all ran the same headline. "Teen who killed disabled sister sentenced to 12-40 years." On social media, public opinion was sharply divided. Some called it justice, others called it failure. Outside the courthouse, small groups gathered holding signs that read, "Kids deserve a second chance," and "Mental illness needs treatment, not chains." In the days that followed, editorials appeared across Pennsylvania questioning whether the law should ever treat a child as an adult. One columnist wrote, "Justice, like grief, is never clean. It leaves scars on everyone it touches. Another asked, how do we measure punishment when the person punished barely understood the crime? The debate reached the state capitol, where juvenile advocates began pushing again for reform. The echoes of that sentence stayed long after the courtroom emptied. The benches, the quiet hallways, even the ticking clock above the clerk's desk seemed to carry the weight of what had just been decided. For the Miller family, there was no victory. Only two futures lost on the same night. Helen, whose laughter once filled their home, would never come back. And Claire, still barely old enough to drive, would spend most of her life behind prison walls. Outside, the courthouse steps glistened with melting snow as reporters packed their cameras and families held each other in silence. A mother had lost both of her daughters, one to violence, the other to a sentence measured in decades. The law had spoken, but peace would not come easily. The sound of the steel door closing behind her at the State Correctional Institution at Muncie marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. Claire Miller, just 16 years old, entered the prison's intake unit on March 17, 2023. Her wrists were still bruised from the transport cuffs, and her hands shook slightly as she handed over her intake forms. The guard who processed her later told Lancaster Online, she looked younger than her age, tiny, quiet, polite. During booking, she was assigned an inmate number, photographed, and taken to the psychological evaluation wing. Within hours, her world had narrowed to a small concrete room with a metal bed, a thin mattress, and a barred window that let in only a slice of Pennsylvania's spring sky. At Muncie, every newly arrived inmate spends several days in isolation for screening. Medical staff assess physical health, mental stability, and risk. The evaluation notes for Claire, summarized in public records, described her as cooperative, subdued, and compliant. The prison's psychiatric unit continued the medications she'd been prescribed during her time in county custody, antidepressants and antipsychotics. She met regularly with a counselor, though sources familiar with the case said she rarely spoke beyond a few sentences. In one of her first sessions, when asked how she felt, she reportedly said, "I know what I did. I just don't know why." The counselor wrote, "Displays remorse, appears confused about motivation. No signs of aggression." Back in Lancaster, the Miller family withdrew from public view. Within months of the sentencing, real estate records showed the family home on Clayton Road was quietly sold through a limited liability company, likely to avoid unwanted media attention. Neighbors told reporters they watched as a moving truck arrived one gray morning and was gone by afternoon. "No one waved," one neighbor recalled. "It was too painful. You just felt the loss on both sides." The house sat vacant for a time before a new family moved in. Each February, though, someone still leaves a small bouquet of flowers at the edge of the driveway, yellow lilies tied with a white ribbon. Locals say they've never seen who leaves them. The community struggled with how to remember Helen. A small memorial service was held in 2021 at a local church, attended by classmates, neighbors, and members of the special needs community, where she volunteered part-time. Her teachers remembered her love for music and her gentle sense of humor. A family friend told WGAL News 8, "Helen was one of those people who made you feel safe just by being near her. Everyone loved her. That simple truth became the hardest part for people to reconcile, a life so pure ended by someone she loved most." As the years passed, Claire's case continued to resonate far beyond Lancaster County. Legal scholars and mental health advocates began citing it in discussions about juvenile justice reform. Pennsylvania is one of the few states that still automatically charges minors as adults in homicide cases, a rule originally intended for older teenagers involved in violent gang crimes. But Claire's case, a 14-year-old girl with no criminal history, severe mental illness, and a disabled sibling as her victim, did not fit that mold. The Juvenile Law Center in Philadelphia issued a statement in 2023 saying, "The Claire Miller case highlights the urgent need to re-examine how Pennsylvania treats children accused of serious offenses. Accountability is essential, but compassion must not be absent." In early 2024, a panel of lawmakers in Harrisburg discussed potential reforms to Pennsylvania's transfer laws. State Senator Amanda Capoletti referenced the Miller case directly, saying, "When a child with severe mental illness commits an act of violence, our justice system must have the flexibility to respond with treatment, not just incarceration." Though no bill passed that year, the discussion reignited statewide attention on the balance between punishment and rehabilitation. Within the walls of Muncie, Claire began adjusting to prison routine. According to Department of Corrections reports, she attended educational programs, therapy sessions, and eventually earned a role cleaning the facility's laundry area. Guards described her as quiet, polite, and compliant. She kept to herself, rarely interacting with older inmates. One officer who spoke anonymously said, "She doesn't cause trouble. She reads, writes in a notebook, and stays out of sight." A counselor later added, "She shows remorse, but it's the kind that never ends. It's like she carries it everywhere." Public attention faded with time, but among those who worked on the case, the emotional impact never did. Detective Keith Neff, who had led the original investigation, told Lancaster Online in a 2024 follow-up interview, "Every so often I think about that night. The snow, the silence, her standing there in the cold. You can't unsee something like that." Another investigator added, "You always ask yourself what could have stopped it. Could we have seen it coming? But sometimes there's no warning, just heartbreak." For many in Lancaster, the tragedy became a quiet symbol of the need to listen. To children, to mental health warnings, to the silence that hides behind closed doors. Churches hosted forums about recognizing early signs of psychosis. Schools implemented new counseling programs. A teacher from Claire's school told ABC 27 News, "If anything good can come from this, it's that we pay closer attention to the quiet kids, because sometimes the ones who smile the least are the ones hurting the most." As of 2025, Claire remains incarcerated at Muncie. Under her sentence, she will be eligible for parole after serving 12.5 years, sometime around 2035. She will be in her late 20s by then. Whether she is ever granted release will depend on her mental health, conduct, and rehabilitation progress. Prison psychologists continue to monitor her condition. In one report filed in late 2024, a staff psychologist noted, "Inmate expresses ongoing guilt, limited understanding of motivation, cooperative with treatment, insight improving." Those words, measured and clinical, marked small progress in a story defined by loss. Meanwhile, every February, Lancaster County media revisit the case. Each year, one article seems to echo the same line: 2 daughters, 1 tragedy, and a community still searching for understanding. At Helen's old school, a scholarship fund was created in her name for students with disabilities who want to study music. It is small but meaningful, an attempt to turn grief into something enduring. The Claire Miller case remains one of Pennsylvania's most haunting reminders of how thin the line between illness and tragedy can be. It forced lawmakers, teachers, and parents to face uncomfortable questions about justice, empathy, and mental health. And for the family who lost both their daughters in one night, the answers may never come. Somewhere inside a quiet prison cell, a young woman still counts the years. And somewhere back in Lancaster, a mother still sets a chair for the daughter who will never come home.